My guest on this episode of the Work Positive podcast walked away from a prestigious position in a highly respected ad agency in 1990. He wondered to himself, how can a job this good be this bad? Puzzled, he turned from writing for famous brands to writing about the cultures that drive them, the brand inside. What followed was a 30-plus year quest to understand what makes people happy and productive at work. Along the way, he directed some projects for the Drucker Institute, Ken Blanchard, John Maxwell, Henry Cloud, Tony Robbins, while shaping culture for companies like UPS, Delta, Salesforce, and Chick-fil-A. His new book is Culture is the New Leadership. His landmark findings shaped the Culture MRI, a system for measuring culture and building a sought-after work environment. It's the only system that measures engagement in teams in terms of actual dollars of profitability and EBITDA. So go get your CFO, lean in, listen up, and love your work on this episode of the Work Positive Podcast.
Welcome to the Work Positive Podcast with your host, executive coach, and culture architect, Dr. Joey Fawcett. Discover strategies and tactics that work positive as Dr. Joey talks with industry leaders who create a positive work culture that attracts top talent and reduces team turnover. Discover how you can create a work positive culture that increases productivity and profits. Here's your host, Dr. Joey.
Hey, Work Positive Nation, this is the Ben Ortlip. Ben, welcome to Work Positive Nation, my friend.
I'm feeling positive.
Are you positively positive?
I'm positive. I'm working.
Wonderful. Well, I am so stoked about having you on this program because you represent what I think is the new culture experience for companies that are serious about culture today.
Well,
The reason I say that is because you heard me say in the introduction that Ben's Culture MRI can literally connect culture, behavior, and practices in your company, the development of those with profitability. And he has an assessment that is absolutely amazing. So there, I said it, Ben, you're my favorite. I appreciate you being on the podcast today.
send me a Venmo link.
Oh, I thought you already sent me $20. Was that not enough for $20 or did I overshot it? Okay. Another $20 on my way. That's amazing.
I haven't mentioned your name.
Yeah. So Ben, you left an ad agency in 1990, as I said in the introduction. It's always interesting to me what prompts people to leave and to do something different. What was the crisis point for you that really moved you to want to go in the direction in which you find yourself today?
I think the point that I like to emphasize about that is that I didn't really know what it was. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time.
Mhm.
And I think that's important because so often it's the things that we don't really put our finger on that are what drive us to leave. I think we're getting better, and sometimes we are blessed with the clarity of what it is that bothers us. But I think in terms of if you're a person who leads an organization and you're in charge of attracting and retaining people, I think it's important to recognize that often it's the things that are just below the radar that add up on people and cause them, even though they can't put their finger on it, to just kind of want to be somewhere else. Or worse, to sort of not leave, but sort of back off of the effort that they contribute every day. In my case, there was a lack of opportunity for me. I wasn't able to see exactly, even though technically there was opportunity for me, but there were some subtleties in the way I was being managed that left some of what I considered to be, a little more attractive options. So they could check a box that they were giving me a career path and so forth, but the reality was it wasn't lined up with, the vision that I had for where I was going. There were some other things too. And so, but yeah, it showed up for me as kind of a disinterest in the work that had originally attracted me to be at this place. And that sort of kicked off my whole journey to sort of want to understand what is that. I actually became more interested in that than the work that I was doing at the time.
Yeah, because you were observing these companies you were writing about and wondering what drove the culture in those companies, right? And so you got
Well, yeah,
curious about that.
that actually came later. So my original job, I was in advertising and I was a writer. And so when I left that business, I just became a freelance writer. And by no plan of my own, I ended up writing for a lot of these thought leaders, kind of, I guess you'd call it ghostwriting, where these people that write about leadership and management and about workplaces. And I was sort of in charge of, polishing their books or turning them into workshops and things like that. So I really inadvertently developed a command for the concepts that they were promoting and developing and teaching to people. So the more, it's funny because I'm writing about these things, and then little by little I start to personalize them. I sort of go, yeah, I know what that's like because I've been there. So
Mm.
so that's kind of how it happened. It was a providential kind of intersection where I ended up coming full circle back to the very things that I had experienced. And that's when I got especially curious about, workplace experiences and employee value propositions and things like that.
Yeah, and these weren't just any thought leaders you were ghostwriting for. These were people like Peter Drucker and Ken
People you may,
Blanchard and John Maxwell. I mean, just a few household names. You're being very humble.
people you may have heard of, yeah.
Yeah. Or read a book or two of theirs, right?
Yeah.
So you started to personalize it and you said, hey, I know what this is like. What was that next evolution for you in terms of saying, hey, this is something I want to study and really dig into?
Well, I think, I'm sort of a wonderer. I wonder about things a lot, and a tinkerer. So that made me naturally valuable as a writer because, more than just, what people look for in a writer is somebody who will explore different angles on things and not just regurgitate the same old, that they've already stated so beautifully. Um, so, so I took very, seriously the content that they were dealing with and really thought deeply about it. Um, what really led me to, uh, I guess, become passionate about the work was when, beyond just writing about those things, I was beginning to get invited into organizations because I had such a mastery of their concepts. I was a little bit like a master's degree or PhD holder in some of those things just from having spent so much time around them.
Mm.
It was when I started, I guess you call it consulting work, when I started working with leaders and organizations trying to help them solve these problems and apply those principles. And I was dealing with real people, not just theoretical entities.
Mm.
That's when I started to get more and more passionate about actually helping folks.
Mm. Because then you began to see the application of those principles and the transformation it
Yeah.
made in their lives as well as the company's culture.
Yeah, I could
Well,
see what was at stake in
yeah.
the outcomes, not just in the individual lives, but also it's more fun when you can see a point A in a company and then do some work and see, the point B, the fruition of what you did there.
Yeah, some tangible outcomes and results. Where was the transformation point for you been in terms of beginning to make application of culture principles to profitability within a company?
Yeah, so that actually that came much later.
Hmm.
Uh, so realize too that I would say that the content that I was dealing with was kind of management content and leadership content. It's not unimportant that all of a sudden the word culture started showing up, and I think that's how it kind of came up for most people. shortly after Y2K, maybe within that first decade, people started using the word culture. In fact, I think it was the Merriam-Webster Word of the Year in like 2012, literally, because it was just such a popular word all of a sudden. And really what that expresses is that people were starting to say, we've talked about management, we've talked about leadership, but then there's this new thing. We don't know what it is yet, but we're calling it culture. And that was a significant development in the kind of broader landscape of things. Way before I started quantifying it, there was this moment where I started recognizing that, wow, everybody's talking about culture. And as a person who had been trained by the very best of the best about management and then about leadership, I looked at culture and I said, who's the expert on culture? Where can I go to learn what this is? And so, I think it's important to note that, it wasn't so much how to quantify it. First, it was for me, it was like, what is it? How do you codify it even before you quantify it? So probably 12 to 15 years ago, I was walking around, just like everybody, I was walking around going, I know culture is important, and I could say that, it's probably core values, mission, vision, traditions, all of those words that people used to use to try to define what it is, rituals. And there's some anthropology that people would sort of refer to, but we all just were kind of trying to figure out what it is back then.
We knew it when we saw it, but we didn't know how to describe all of it
Yeah. I
necessarily.
think what's important about that is that's how difficult it is to measure it. Think about going from there, because if you asked 100 people what is culture in your organization, you're going to get more than 100 answers back, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so, to point out that's how far it was for me being able to link it to profitability and anything like that. So the first development for me was, defining it adequately. And so that led me to, I spent a lot of time thinking about it. I was haunted so what happened for me was one of my ghostwriting clients approached one day and said, hey, let's write a book about culture. And I found that pretty exciting because I'd been wanting to know what culture is, and I'd kind of been looking for somebody to teach me, to pay me to learn it, like I'd done for leadership and management.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was kind of disappointing. I spent a year working with this client on a book about culture, supposedly, and it was pretty evident early on that this person was still trying to figure it out too. So there was this category, and I was like, yeah, but that's just leadership principles, and you're pointing to the fact that leadership affects culture and it creates the outcome, but I'm not sure that stands alone as a definition of the target of the topic. So after a year of working on a book, we kind of looked at each other and fired each other one day, and both very amicably agreeing that neither one of us was ready to write a book. Well, I mentioned that I was already doing consulting in companies, and so for the next 2 or 3 years after that point, I was just followed around by that concept, by the nagging question, what is culture and how is it different from leadership, or how is it different from management? And as I was working with companies, I started exploring the line between culture and those other things, and trying things out. And long story short, I ended up with a framework, a model that I could replicate. Really what happened was I discovered that culture does take a turn toward anthropology, and it's measured and really takes place in the ethos of the people that populate an organization. And so the center point for that for me became the psychometrics of what drives and motivates workplace productivity and performance. And so there's this sort of invisible space that follows every person that goes to work every day. And that space is either filled with all of the support and all of the headspace, all of the attitudes and everything that lead to high performance, or it's filled with something else. And the way that that gets filled is very tangible and very codifiable, things that are, many of which are well within the control of the organization. And so the framework, what it did was organize those things. And it's essentially a lot like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There's things that people need when they go to work in order to thrive and perform. And if those needs are met incorrectly or completely negligently, then it really affects their performance. It affects their engagement and their interest in work. And eventually that'll show up in the metrics for the company as well. So that was sort of the two-stage for me, the two-stage evolution was, first of all, what is culture? And then the more I got into quantifying the psychometrics, I realized that, well, wait a minute, if there's some great white papers that I found that had been there for decades, but nobody paid financial attention to them, that showed the direct link between someone's engagement and someone's output. And so I said, well, gosh, if you're paying that guy $100,000 and if engagement is 46% of what they deliver, in other words, 54% of it's compulsory. They're either going to show up that day or not.
Yeah.
And 46% of it is up for grabs, depending on how engaged they are, So I just took all the psychometrics of that 46% and amortize across the dollar value of whatever you're paying that person. So I can go into an organization and I can aggregate all of the money spent on labor and reverse engineer out of that what I call a return on labor formula. And then we measure sentiment among the people. And, that's kind of the basic idea of how you can determine the dollar value of engagement in a company. And then having the individual psychometrics that support that allows you to, amortize those down to the individual things. And suddenly you've got this sort of gap analysis for what's the state of culture in the organization. They tell, our dashboard enables you to look at it and see where the problems are and how to remediate, fix those things and what it's costing you. A lot of problems aren't really worth fixing if it costs you $10 million to fix a $50 problem. At least this way, so you're not just guessing. And that's my concern, is that so many leaders are really just guessing when it comes to culture. They read a book that has a lot of good ideas, or they hear how the Navy SEALs do it, and how is that relevant to our organization? And so we just kind of guess, and we spend a lot of money to build a Zen room in our company, or, to, let people work from home. We don't understand the impact of that. Casual Fridays, bring your dog to work, whatever it is, a lot of it is just a guessing game. And I've just always preferred a more codified approach to culture and being able to quantify the value of it to the organization. It's, to me, the wave of the future. I've always noticed that there's been sort of three epochs in business. There was if you will, fundamentally, we have to bring a product to market or service. And then, so originally, business was about who has the best product and who could bring a product. And then there was sort of this, incremental improvements over the processes that we would use. And over the years, we've got diminishing returns even from that. So So we had product, process, and I feel like now the untapped potential lies in people, because people performance is this sort of blue ocean that most companies aren't doing a very good job. And yet 46%, almost half of a person's effort is up for grabs as to whether they're, engaged and enticed and incented well.
Hmm.
So
So how do you do these assessments within a company? I mean, is it all check circles on the screen? Are there live interviews? What are some methods that you use?
yeah, so well, it is an assessment. Once you know the
Hmm.
psychometrics, once you know the
Hmm.
things that matter,
Right,
it's pretty straightforward as far to how to measure those things.
right.
So yeah, we have people take an assessment. It takes about 6 minutes, and when the whole organization does that, and they're convinced that they are in the cone of silence, and they really can, share honestly without fear of retribution. They tell you exactly where it hurts. It's just like if you go into the doctor, and they're trying to figure out why you're sick, and you just tell them, well, it hurts over here. I can't sleep at night. The symptoms, they lay out the symptoms, and it's pretty easy to triage and figure out what's going on. So that's how we measure it. We do some field work as well, interviewing people and maybe looking at processes and things like that. But that's been the thing it's surprising to a lot of people is culture is not only how people feel, a lot of it is operational stuff that causes their feelings.
Hmm.
So for example, if I create a system in the company that feels futile to people, or it feels inefficient and wasteful,
Hmm.
and they know that they're contributing to this by doing it the hard way all the time. So think about that. That shows up as a psychometric, but it's linked to a very tangible operational process or system that I could control as a leader. And so I can go in and fix that, and suddenly it changes the psychometrics of the people that work there, and it changes the way they perform.
Hmm.
So, you know, even though I'm mostly dealing in the anthropology and psychology world, it's using those sciences to get to the science of business and management and ultimately economics. So it doesn't stay in the sort of frou-frou ethereal world very long.
Right. Yeah. It moves from squishy to driving hard dollars of
That's right.
profitability for the
Yeah,
company. So what
that's
have
the whole
been,
point.
yeah, what have been some of the results that surprised you about, here's what we measured, here's what we heard the people say, and then here's the operational strategy and process that's causing that.
Yeah, the probably the biggest surprise is how practical the solutions are.
Hmm.
Um, Most of the companies that we analyze, they don't have problems with what most people would think of as culture. They don't have problems in the area of, let's inject some fun into the workplace, or let's keep it from being mundane. You remember in the 80s, there was a lot of job rotation, to keep people from being burned out too much. And
Hmm.
that was, I guess, a reasonable attempt. But it's not really about people's feelings. What surprises me is how it's about people's needs. And needs are different from feelings because needs point to the support that people need in order to have a workplace where they can thrive and perform. So, a
Hmm.
lot of times, it's very tactical, operational solutions that are causing problems for people. Things like span of control. I don't get the support, or training. They're trying to save money on training. They know that uptime is expensive, and so they send people out without them having real clarity or readiness to perform a competency. Those are the things that, think about the psychology of that for someone. One of the most frustrating encounters that somebody can have is to be expected to do something that they aren't quite ready to do yet. And then to be measured based on that in terms of performance, that is a psychological killer right there. And you can count on that person not staying engaged in their work for very long if that's the case. So the solutions for stuff like that are very management practical, and they're very measurable and they directly affect the bottom line. But you shouldn't invest in them just arbitrarily. You have to know that that's the issue and which one of those is the issue. So
Yeah. So the diagnosis becomes the key to then effective treatment of that.
yeah. And think about what this probably sounds like to people. I thought this was a podcast episode about culture. And here, really, I'm talking about, basic stuff that everybody's familiar with, management principles or leadership principles. And that's probably the biggest surprise that I'm talking about, is that culture isn't really this sort of, fuzzy layer that's on the outside of everything else we do. It's actually the stuff that we do for a living that shapes and impacts culture and determines engagement and performance.
Ben Ortlip is my guest on this episode of the Work Positive podcast. While you're listening, if you're, I'm sure you're as intrigued as I am, flip over to the culturemri.com. It's in the show notes for you there, the culturemri.com, and look through some of the pages he's got there. We'll talk a little bit more about what you'll find there in just a moment. So, Ben, you're a ghostwriter, and you decide to write your own book. And by the way, that's in the show notes. Also, Culture is the New Leadership. You can click there and go get your copy from Amazon. What was that like for you? I mean, here you are as a ghostwriter, and then boom, you're going to write your own book.
Yeah. In some ways, it's not as hard as you think.
Uh-huh.
I had a lot of practice on how to write a book. Of course, it's a lot like cutting your own hair,
Yeah.
You can't see the back of your own head. You can't really write a book about your own ideas. It's not the same thing.
Which is not an issue for me at all. But anyway, go ahead. Yeah, I get it.
But so, part of it too was that I was figuring this out. And so even though I was seeing tremendous results 10 or 12 years ago, some of the companies that I was able to try these ideas out on were well-known companies, and within 3 years they would double in size in terms of top line revenue based on really primarily just these concepts. When you change the culture, it changes the organization that much. So I was seeing practical results, and I knew I wanted to write about it and to formalize it in a book, but it was still sort of a work in progress, and I didn't have the simple clarity that I thought a book would deserve for somebody. I had a lot of anecdotes and I had a lot of disparate kind of concepts that I knew were true, but fortunately I didn't have time to make progress with the book and for another decade or so. And the value of having waited was that things really baked and came together. There's a lot more clarity and simplicity in how I'm able to articulate about it now. The framework is rock solid. It's been tested and proven. And then also this idea, you asked earlier about how to quantify the financials and bake that in. That actually came pretty recently. I'd say within the last 5 years, we sort of recognized that that was a layer that was ready to be added to help the sort of CFO conversations. That wouldn't have probably been included had I written a book 10 years ago. So a lot of little things like that, but writing the book itself, it really helps to have another person to look over your shoulder and and tell you when you need a story to add. And so I've
Yeah.
got great people around me, and have included a lot of writer friends and
Mm-hmm.
colleagues. So
Mm-hmm.
it was difficult. I normally can write a book in less than a year, but this one took 10. So
Well, you would serve no book before its time, though.
right.
And I love what you're talking about there in terms of waiting for the baking process to occur, or maybe fermentation is a better metaphor here. Yeah, and so getting it to that point where you could really deliver something that people would gain value and benefit from. I admire that about you, Ben. Uh, Ben Ortlip is my guest on this episode of the Work Positive podcast. In the show notes, there's the culturemri.com. So you can go there to that website. What are we going to find when we go there, Ben?
Well, our goal with the website is really just to uh, provide some explanation and overview of what this thing is. And let me just tell you, this isn't easy for us to communicate, because we're not only entering a product into the conversation, but we're actually sort of inventing a category. And worse than that, we're trying to describe a category that's been wrongly described and understood up until this point.
Mm,
So uh, the goal with the website is to try to unravel some of the miscommunication that's existed about culture, and the oversimplified understanding of it being kind of a fuzzy outer layer of a company. And we redefine it as, no, the culture is the byproduct of everything you do as a business.
mm,
So it's very tangible. It does shape the attitudes and the values of the people. And even though you may have a set of core values, who's to say that they in any way reflect the values of the people at the front lines that are delivering customer experience to people? So
absolutely.
unless
Yeah.
you're willing to look at how business and operations shape the values that show up on the customer experience,
Mm,
uh, this is the way we're redefining culture. We're sort of taking, hey, it's not really from the outside in. This is something that has to come from the inside out, and it has to be done right, because if you only try to, just fashion some objective core values and then put them on a marble plaque, it doesn't really work. And so there's our process, and the website will explain some of this. Um, is really to try to describe the linkage between the psychology of the workers and the operations of the business. And then we add this piece about being able to quantify that in terms of your financials.
Hmm, sweet. All right. So that's the culturemri.com. It's in the show notes there, as is Cultures and New Leadership, link to Ben's new book over on Amazon. And then also we've got Ben's LinkedIn profile there, because I know you're going to want to reach out to him, Work Positive Nation, and continue the conversation and the dialogue about this redefinition, a product, and then the whole category of understanding culture as an inside out job. Ben, Work Positive Nation always wants to know from my guests, so I got to ask you, man. Ben Ortlip, what's one thing that you would suggest that Work Positive Nation start doing today to create a positive work culture?
Well, I think the main thing is to measure and map the needs of your people. And you might need some help. You can certainly just steal from our website a list of the psychometrics that we think matter. If you want to use our tools to measure those, of course, we'd be thrilled about that. But unless you know what your people need, then there's really, it's potluck as to whether you'll ever give them what they need in order to perform well. And I'll give you this tip. Our framework, if you come into it thinking in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that is sort of, there's a direct correlation. There's a video on the About page that explains the historical connection. Here's what I think is important about that. The workplace today is the first workforce in the history of all civilizations that has reached what Maslow called self-actualization. Before this time, the workforce was motivated by survival or motivated by success. But for the first time in the history of the world, we have a workforce that's motivated by significance. And that changes everything about how you run a company. So that video explains that. It's on the About page. And that to me is the best distinction about this sort of category that we're trying to promote. And, my mission, yes, I want to run a profitable company myself and all that. But really my mission is to help people understand this, people who are leading businesses. What haunts me is, I walked away from the job that I didn't like, and I've been fortunate enough to end up in work that's enjoyable, but I don't have to think too hard to remember how just really terrifying it is to have to go to the place that you don't want to go to and to do that day after day, year after year. And so, 150 million people wake up in this country every day facing a job that they either like or they don't. And Gallup does a good job of reminding us that 2 out of 3 of those people don't like it. And I think we can change that. And the key to that is to be able to design an employee value proposition that is satisfying and gives people what they need, not just what is in the contract.
That's amazing. Thank you, Ben, so much. The culturemri.com is the website. Go down below and click on that link in the show notes. Ben, I've learned so much from you today. I appreciate the conversation. Thanks for helping us think at the next level about what culture really is and how it moves from the inside out, and the significance of the work that you're doing, as well as the rest of us around culture. Thank you, my friend.
Thanks, Joey.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Work Positive Podcast. Please share this podcast with your friends who are HR and small business leaders so they can do one thing today to create a positive work culture that increases productivity and profits. I'd like to give you a free Work Positive course just for listening. It's called Something to Talk About, and it's transformed the work conversations of so many people all over the world. Get your free copy when you go to workpositive.today/something to talk about, and you can start transforming your conversations today. Remember, it pays to work positive.